Hello, and welcome to the Sailing and Cruising the East Coast of the United States podcast. I'm Bela Musits.
And I'm Mike Wasserman.
This is our episode about sailing the East Coast of the United States. In some episodes, we will focus on passages and destinations. In other episodes, we'll talk about boats, equipment, and techniques. And when we come across an interesting person, we'll try to get them as a guest on the show. But before we dive into this episode, we need to say a special thank you to our supporters. Several listeners are supporting the podcast by using Patreon. If you would like to join them, you can go to patreon.com/sailing the East.
Yeah, that's great, Bela. Always happy to have more listeners and more supporters. But let's think about today. And I'm really excited to hear about who we're going to talk with on this episode.
Yeah, so repeat guest. So you listeners might remember back in episode 84 and 85, we talked to Simon and Sawyer about their preparations for making their first Atlantic crossing on their Passport 40 sailboat. Well, they departed Newport, Rhode Island, and have made it to Horta, which is in the Azores. That's approximately 2/3 of the way across the Atlantic, and it's a very popular place for people to stop, regardless of whether they're heading east or heading west. It's sort of 800 miles off the coast of Spain, and everybody stops there, regardless of the direction they're going. So in this episode, we check in with them while they're in Horta, and we talked about their journey so far and how it went. There was a lot of great lessons in this one. Boy, it was very eye-opening to me, some of the things that they experienced. And then we also talk a little bit about their preparations for their final leg to the United Kingdom.
Yeah, I'm excited to hear how the first part of this trip went, Bela. And just you mentioned it, but I think it's worth mentioning again. If there's new listeners or listeners that don't listen regularly, check out first 84 and 85, those two episodes with Simon and Sawyer first. Then they talk all about the preparations that they made and the planning that went into it. And it'll really make listening to this episode, I think, a lot more worthwhile. But on that note, let's get right to part one and see how Simon and Sawyer fared on the trip from Newport to the Azores Islands.
Awesome.
Hey, Sawyer, Simon, good to see you guys again.
We're back. Hey, Bela, we made it.
Yeah, so last time we spoke, just to bring our listeners up to speed, you guys were in Rhode Island, and you guys were planning your trip across the Atlantic, your first sail across the Atlantic. And so that was the last time our listeners heard from you guys. So where are you now?
We're not in Rhode Island anymore. We're currently calling from Pete's Cafe Sport in Horta, the Azores. It's a little more tropical than Rhode Island. Took us a little while to get here, but
yeah, we made it.
We made it.
Yeah, we made it. Everyone's accounted for. And Bailey, if you remember, we were going to do like a way in and a way out. At least for me, it doesn't show it anymore, but I definitely lost weight on this trip. And we have a lot of food left over. So that was our experience. And actually talking to a lot of other people here, it was the same. They all had great plans and complicated meals, and they were like nursing crackers for 3 weeks. So,
Yeah.
any other listeners planning a big trip? Maybe you're different, but I would say you may be surprised at how little you can and really want to eat on the trip.
Yeah. And is that because you felt a little seasick most of the time, or just anxiety, or?
Yeah, I mean, probably all those things. I was quite seasick, actually. And I've had, I get mildly seasick. Usually it resolves itself after 3 or 4 days when, we travel together. But I was pretty seasick the whole way in my case.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not, these, and we learned this in, the wilderness first responder, right? Your systems are all connected. So if you don't sleep well and you're anxious and you're sick, and then you don't eat well and then you're anxious, and it goes around and around. So we were able to work through it. I was able to work through it, but I was not thinking about food much of the time.
Sure.
Yeah. So did you take any medications?
I didn't have like patches. I took some of that over the counter,
Oh, you guys just.
and yeah, I did. Go ahead.
So you guys got choppy there. So I think the last coherent thing was, did you take any medications? And reply to that question.
Okay. Yeah, no prescription medication. I took some of the, over the counter, and but after a few days, actually, even the idea of taking a pill kind of made me sick. So
yeah, when you can't keep stuff down, it doesn't work super well, does it?
Yeah. I mean, it was okay. I don't want to exaggerate, but point being, I wasn't thinking about food.
All right. So let's just recap here a little bit. The plan is to sail all the way across the Atlantic. You're not all the way across yet, if I remember my geography. Horta and the Azores are about what, 2/3 of the way across?
Yeah, more or less.
Yeah. And so you guys departed on Newport. What date was that? Do you remember?
It was in early June.
Yeah, we had a plan for I think Monday the 5th, and then based on our weather routing recommendations, we held off a couple days.
Yeah.
And so in all together, it took just under 17 days to cross.
Okay.
I remember.
And was that sort of what you expected? Was that longer than expected? I'm not calibrate me here.
Yeah, we actually, so they typically say the range for the Newport to Azores is a pretty common route, and a standard time range for that, they say, is between 16 and 22 days, in that range.
Yeah.
And so 17 is actually on the earlier side of that range, which we were pretty happy with, because we're not racers and we weren't pushing very hard.
Yeah.
I think we spent the first 3 days motoring, and I think we were pretty we didn't really hesitate to motor, when it was calm. And so I think for the folks who aren't doing that, like some of the people that we've seen on the dock, they hit a calm patch and they just sit in it for 3 days. And in our case, we were going 5 knots.
And then that allowed us to get really a great weather pattern after that, and we had 20 to 30 knots behind us for the rest of the way. So yeah, we met a guy on the dock who came in 34 days after leaving, and he left the same day we did. But he sat off of Nantucket for 3 days, but then also couldn't catch the weather that we caught, and it kind of went from there.
Wow.
So no, we were pleased with our trip, and talking to people here, that was fast.
Yeah, it was. And we were, we really only had one kind of period of time where we weren't making any progress. That was about halfway through the trip. We had to heave to for about 12 hours, wait for a front to pass through. But otherwise, we were right on course, headed due east, doing like 4 to 6 knots for most of the way. Yeah.
Ah, very nice. So what are the things that went as expected?
We arrived. I mean, I will say that you're sort of, for me, and I tend to be kind of goal oriented, your goals do shift, right? So it was just to get here in one piece, right? All hands accounted for. We take good care of our boat, but actually at some point I really wasn't that worried about the boat as long as we arrived. So yeah, I think that was okay. What else went as expected? I mean, we didn't have any disasters.
No, we didn't have any disasters. I mean, I think for me, the sailing was kind of as I expected, if not even maybe a little easier.
Yeah.
Like the physical, the plan and the navigation side of it. There really wasn't much navigating. I mean, we had weather routers that were helping us, but the route that they were giving us was pretty much just the Great Circle route to the Azores, right? And that was pretty much what we did. I mean, we tried to sail east, and sometimes there were small deviations there, but it wasn't. It was really easy. It wasn't very complicated, I think.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
I think the other thing that we were happy it worked so well was our communication systems. So we talked about last time, we had Iridium Go for satellite communication. We had a second one for backup, and we had a SSB for backup to that. And then we communicated with you, Bela, actually as our onshore kind of support person. And yeah, I think that went pretty well. We were tended, we didn't really lose connectivity, and we were able to communicate with the outside world. We got weather updates. I think one day we were feeling so lousy, we kind of forgot to text you, and then you texted us like, "Hey guys, everything all right?" And we're like, "Oh yeah, sorry, we're just kind of feeling lousy." you do lose a sense of time, obviously, right? Because it's just like 16, 17 days, and you're not really sleeping much, and you're not eating the way you normally eat. So just 1 hour falls into another hour. But yeah, we were able. I mean, it's kind of amazing, right? That you can sail across the ocean and still be in touch with people. It's
Right.
really it really changed the way you can sail. It's wonderful.
Yeah. So, what were I want to leave the equipment stuff and the challenges you had there till the end. So, from the point of view of the experience, what were the things that happened that were sort of unexpected, or either better than you expected them to be, or there was more of a challenge than you expected them to be?
Sure. I got some, but
I mean, so I think like starting broad and dialing in, one of the things that surprised me was how kind of hands off we were sailing wise, right? So, when we were coastal sailing or, motoring through the ICW or sailing around Maine, whatever, right? You're in the cockpit, you're very dialed in of where the boat is, where you're sailing, what's your VMG, right? We need to tack to get around this island. Like, when are we going to do that, right?
Right.
And when you're out in the middle of the ocean, there's nothing to hit. So,
Right.
We point the bow towards the east, we get a sail plan, and then we wouldn't really change things, for several hours at a time. And so, we spent much more of our time down below. And obviously, we'd poke our heads out to look for things. We had AIS and radar, but we were not, in the cockpit hand steering, trying to, hold a course. We would set the wind vane, we'd set the sails, and then we wouldn't make an adjustment for 6 hours or 12 hours. Overnight, like we'd set a sail plan at sunset, and we wouldn't really think about it until sunrise.
Yeah.
And that was just very new. And honestly, it was nice, but unexpected.
And part of that's again, we were cruising, and we intentionally our goal was to get here, right, and get here safely.
Right.
So
right.
if it's 16 days or 22 days, that was okay. And so we weren't trying to steer down every wave, or adjust everything. I think we had like a 3 days, Sawyer, where we didn't even touch the sails. We had the whisker pull out.
Yeah,
no. It was like 3 or 4 days, I think. It was different.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that was cool. And the wind vane was a champ. We'd gotten pretty comfortable with our wind vane before, but we used the wind vane the entire trip, and it's kind of funny. You get this kind of sixth sense when you're down below, right? And you can feel the boat, you can feel how it's doing, and when it gets a little out of trim or something's off, you can feel it.
Sure.
And so the development of that feeling was pretty new, right? I think from our coastal sailing background, we're used to being in the cockpit, and you see it visually when something's off, right? We're off course, or the wind speed increases or whatever. But when you're down below, you're sleeping, and then you feel the boat power up a little too much, or one wave hits a little differently, and
Yeah. So and I would look at each other, and we
And
both knew it's time to go out. It's time to get on deck and do something. We don't want to, but we better do it. We both knew at the same time. So
Yeah.
that was cool. Yeah.
And
Yeah, I mean, I'll say some things.
Sure.
I mean, it was really hard for me. I'll say that. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, physically and and mentally. I was probably not prepared for it to be so physically hard. I don't mean like trying to raise the main or whatever. It's physically hard because in my case, it was very difficult to sleep. And if you did sleep, I was sleeping for 10 minutes or 20 minutes at a time. And that's okay for a day or two. You get into a week or so,
Right.
it's another level of exhaustion that I didn't really understand. So, and then as I mentioned before, these systems are all interrelated, right? So if you don't sleep very well, your digestive system kind of shuts down. And I was getting very, very dehydrated. And so I remember one day my goal was, I just got to drink this one bottle of water. I'm just going to, sip by sip, I'm going to drink it, hold it, and try to get myself out of this cycle. So, that was, I don't want to be over dramatic, but it was, it was physically. And then, part of it also too is anxiety level, because I in my case, I felt very responsible having both my son and my father on board. And so you're always sleeping with one eye open. Every little creak, I look up, is everything okay? Is my dad just like fallen overboard?
Right,
So,
right.
yeah, it's really tough. That being said, and I also don't mean to exaggerate, I'm not, it was probably the best experience after my kids being born that I've ever had in my life. So that final morning, and I think it was 2 nights in a row without sleeping. I'm really not sleeping. That final morning, the sun came up and we looked out and you could see the volcano of the Azores popping through the clouds. And immediately you had all your energy back, and it was, I'll never forget that moment. That was, like I said, apart from my kids being born, that's number 3. Really cool.
Nice, nice. So I did want to ask a couple of other questions. Well, one is, how did your power plan work out, right? You have some solar cells. You guys made the Hard Dodger. So let's talk about the Hard Dodger edition a little bit, the solar cells and your sort of power management.
Yeah, sure. Well, you can start with the Hard Dodger and I'll go into the power. That's kind of how we split up the...
Yeah. Oh, so it's very simply, the Hard Dodger, it went on great. We talked last time about, I wasn't sure, well, I couldn't get out the building, but once I got out the building, it went on very well. And we got everything mounted with the solar panels, and we got mounted some other gear up there, and it didn't blow away. It was really sturdy. So we do have some tie down points that we thought we could use if the winds got higher. But no, it was a great addition, and it definitely changed the feel of the cockpit and allowed us to have all the solar. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
And then, I mean, the solar edition was, I think, a real game changer. We have had a surplus of power every day, and during the trip, this was another unexpected thing, I suppose. It was cloudy almost every day.
Yeah. We had the wildfire. Right?
Yeah, so we had the wildfire. The Canadian wildfires were producing all this haze when we were leaving Newport, and then once we got out of range of the wildfires, it was just cloudy. So we only had 2 days out of that 17 with blue skies. Mm-hmm. It was completely overcast, pretty much the rest of the time. But even with that, we were operating at a power surplus, and we essentially just didn't have to think about it. And then once we got to Horta, right, like we've been having hot showers with our hot water heater, and we still end the day with 100% power all the time. We have our fridge and our freezer running constantly. We just don't think about it.
Yeah. So just to remind folks, what we did, we've got a total of 600 watts, mm-hmm. right? So 3 200-watt solar panels, crystalline solar panels, and we have a charge controller for each one.
Yeah.
Kind of for some redundancy. And we have a 1500-watt inverter. Mm-hmm. And yeah, in noon with some good sun, we're producing about 32 amps.
Yeah.
Which is shore power, basically.
Yeah, that's the equivalent of plugging in at the dock, and that's what we get at noon on a sunny day. And actually, just kind of an important technical point, having individual charge controllers for every panel is actually extremely important.
True too, yeah.
Because what we found, diagnosing the system and whatnot, is we have 3 panels and they're on the Dodger, and it forms kind of this inverted U, right? So the one in the center is perfectly horizontal, and then one and one that are kind of tilted. And so when we're sailing, it's extremely common for at least one of those panels to be blocked, either because the boat's heeled over and one of them's facing away from the sun, or we have the boom that's covering one of them, or whatever. And if we had all of them on one charge controller, then that one panel would sync the entire array, right? But because we have each panel controlled individually, each panel is producing about 12 amps. And so we can get the full 12 amps, from the 2 that are powered up, then the third one is producing any power. Yeah, that's really important. I hadn't really thought about that when we were designing the system. Been a real advantage.
Yeah, so putting a charge controller on each one, was that something you read about? Was that some advice somebody gave you, or where did that sort of notion come from?
So honestly, it came because the charge controllers have a maximum capacity. And so the boat, as we had received it from the previous owner, had 2 charge controllers for a 4-panel array. And honestly, it was just because I'm a little neurotic, and I'm thinking, okay, if you have 4 panels, divide by 2, you get 2, that works out. If you have 3 panels, how do you get 3 panels on the 2 charge controllers? It just seemed kind of weird, right? But we already had the system in place where you have one charge controller that's the master, or the head one, and then the other charge controllers are sort of the slaves. They're just they take the lead from the one charge controller. So you build with the equivalent of one charge controller out of all these little ones. And so because we already had that system in place, I could see it, and I could see the wiring, I could see how they had done it before. Then the process of just adding a third one and duplicating all that effort wasn't hard. I didn't really read or hear about it online. I haven't.
You're right about that concept of, I think a lot of these panels, they will basically, it's not like it's linear. They'll stop working if they're less than 50%.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, it's not even. I mean, I'm not an electrical engineer, but my understanding of it is if you have even just one cell of a 30-cell panel covered, it can, reduce it by 80%. It can
again,
really.
There's a formula there. So you're right. If the boat's heeled over or the sail is blocking like one panel.
Yeah, or your backstay or a flag, anything, right? A seagull.
Right. Right.
We had more power than we thought, so it was good.
Yeah.
And it was very cost effective. So again, if folks are thinking about it or thinking about upgrading, in our case, the whole thing was, I don't know, $800, $600.
Yeah, we just got some like Reynolds-y panels off of Amazon, right? These are not like hard things to find.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
It was good. It was great. Yeah.
Yeah, and it also sounds like having more capacity than you think you're going to need is good because, like you said, typically one of the panels wasn't producing anything. So if you would have only had two, right, and one of those wasn't producing any, then you might end up with a deficit for the day. Yeah.
And again, it's common sense, but you can't assume it's going to be sunny.
Right. Exactly. Yep. Yep.
Right.
And that actually had a surprising effect, right? So we, when it's a nice clear blue sky day, we'll get 32 amps from the panels. The day we left Newport was also a nice sunny day, but full of haze from the wildfires, and we were only getting maybe 10 amps.
Yeah.
Right. So it was reducing our capacity by over 65%.
Yeah. Okay. So next subject, water maker. So, power and water, those are two important things, and lots of crackers. So talk to me about the water maker.
The water maker I thought was really good, really effective. It didn't use much power at all, and it produced an incredible. So, we have one of the smaller water makers that you can get on the market. It produces about 1.5 gallons an hour. But for us, you let it run all day long, and that's like half a tank of water.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, we've got 2 tanks for water, each one's 60 gallons, and we have the water maker feeding one of those tanks. So we kept one tank full, and then the other tank, would get down to about half, and then we'd start the water maker. And like Sawyer said, it's only a small amount of water per hour, but of course you're on a 24-hour day after day after day, so it cranks out the water. We definitely had enough, for drinking and eating, but what we thought really important, maybe you said last time, is it allows us to take showers, which is a real comfort thing, right? We could take a hot shower, even if it's only a minute. It really helps you reset,
Sure.
kind of, back in the game. And we thought that was actually a safety issue, not just a comfort issue, which they're related.
Yeah.
So it was great. Yeah, we had no problems with it. It took us, you got to kind of run it when you first, we put it in new, so we had to run it for a bit to get the initial chemicals out of the filter, right? And then we ran it a little bit more just to be sure we weren't pumping salt water into our tank. And once it was good, then we just let it go.
Yeah.
Well, tasting. And really the limiting factor. So I think on typically on a boat you'd be limited by electrical power.
Yeah.
But in our case, they have to worry about that. It pulls about 4 amps when it's running. But most of the time that was fine. It's honestly a little noisy, and part of it is because of where we installed it. We installed it where our air conditioner used to be. So there's like a big air vent there. It's not insulated.
Yeah, true.
It's right under one of the berths. So I'm sure we could have been a little more thoughtful if we really wanted to. But
I didn't find that noisy, but I don't hear that well.
well, you wouldn't want to sleep on it. I think it's the thing.
That was
right?
under your bed too.
So we can't just run it 24 hours a day because we're trying to sleep, and we're not just sleeping at night, right? We're taking these naps all throughout the day.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that ended up being more of the constraint, was we don't want to be keeping people trying to make water.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We read that typically you need about 3 gallons per person per day for eating, drinking, and cooking. Yeah. So if you're trying to do your formula, your math there. So in our case, we need about 9 gallons per day. So that was, 5 or 6 hours of running. But we had, of course, 120 gallons to start. So.
Yep. Yeah. And just share with us the brand and model of the water maker you had, since it seemed to work very well.
Yeah. So it's the Katahdin, the wherever that mountain is in Maine.
Yeah.
Called the E-Survivor, like 4000E or something. But I think
Something
it's
like that.
E-Survivor.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's one of the reasons we got it. Again, it's got a fairly small footprint. It also though has a manual handle for pumping, so it can be used if we lost power. Say right, it wasn't working, or we got hit by lightning, we could still do it. And then we have like 4 screws to have it mounted underneath our settee. So our kind of bailout plan actually was we could take the screws out, we could grab the whole thing, and I guess we could sit in our life raft and we could make our own water.
Yeah.
So that's a small advantage, but it is an advantage. And but when we installed it, we installed it with service loops for the power and for the hoses, so that if we lost power, we could take the unit out without disconnecting it, right? Sit it on the settee and then pump it that way. So
Got it.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's a nice system, and it was
We got a Defender, right?
Defender, and we installed the two of us in about 6 hours, person hours. So it's not a complicated system.
No, it's super simple. And most of the effort there was like pulling out the old air conditioner.
Yeah, true.
that was sitting in it.
If you can do basic plumbing, PEC style plumbing, you can do it in a few hours.
Yeah. Very good. What about weather? So you guys had a weather router, and you got forecasts from the weather router. How frequently? And talk about that whole experience.
Sure. I mean, this is the first time we'd used a weather router, but I thought it was great. So the one we used, and maybe others are similar, the pricing model is kind of a pay per drink model. So you can use as much or as little as you want. So we initially got a sort of an outlook summary for the area we were sailing in, which is like the North Atlantic, and that's sent to you 2 days before your planned departure. And that's big picture. Here's a low forming, here's a front that may be blocking, blah blah blah, and then some narrative like, based on this, we think you may want to delay a day because you may hit this weather system in 4 days or whatever. So we got that, and in our case, it told us that we might want to consider delaying a couple days,
right?
Because which we did, and then once you confirm with them what you want to do, in our case, leaving on whatever Wednesday, the day before, they will send you either a 3 or a 5 day forecast and a route. And so we did the 5 day at a time. With every 4th day, we asked for a new 5 day, because that 5th day is much less accurate than day 1, right? And it's, again, per drink, and it's very cost effective. We had a little back and forth usually with each forecast, which is nice. Someone's actually there and kind of responding to our questions. A couple times they had an option for us. You could continue to go east. You can sail, but you're going to be getting a little bit heavier weather, or you can go south. Probably allow this front to pass faster, but you're going to have to heave too, and you're going to lose 6 hours. So give us some choices. And then in our case, we didn't use it, but in our case, you can actually phone a friend if you want. There's a small consulting fee for that, and you can email them or call them, and they'll look out for you.
Yeah, sure.
Yep.
So I in the end, we actually, as Sawyer mentioned, we kind of went along the Great Circle route anyway, but it gave us a sense that we had another set of eyes on what we were doing, and probably if we're very experienced, we could predict wind as well as these guys, but they were giving us not just the wind and sea state, also information about the currents, the Gulf Stream currents, also information about thunderstorms, and is it going to be cloudy or what? And it was it was nice.
Yeah, no, I think having an extra set of eyes, for me, it really provided two big benefits. The first is just the reassurance that our plan makes sense, and so we're looking at predict wind, and we're kind of thinking of the Great Circle route and what winds we might hit, and then we get the forecast from them, and it says it's going to be okay. So that's really reassuring. And then the second big value for us has been the departure planning, right? So when do we actually leave? because I think in both cases, we're changing our departure plans to try and optimize that weather window based off of what they're saying. But once we're actually out in the water, the weather routing for us was less routing because we're mostly doing the Great Circle route and more just what are we expecting.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that departure is really important though too, because at least I found myself, right, if you have an idea of when you want to leave, you try to find evidence to support that idea. Right? So there's like 6 different models that you can look at, or 8 now on PredictWind, right? So you look at the first one, GFS, and it's like, ooh, that's going to be nasty in 4 days. Let me look at the European one.
Yeah.
Oh, that's not so bad. Whereas, in this case, these guys said, hey, you could leave on Monday, but you're probably going to see 40 knots on Thursday. And you told us before that you were a small crew that didn't really want to do that. We suggest you leave Wednesday. And it helps to have someone tell you that.
Yeah,
so.
Absolutely.
Yeah, excellent. So what would you mind sharing the name of the weather routing company that you used?
Yeah, in our case, we used, it's called Commander. They're based, I believe, in New Hampshire. They've been doing it for a while, like 30 years. They were recommended to us by our surveyor. He uses them for racing. They do a lot of race routing. And I can't say, they're super great, super easy to talk to. Again, we have some emails back and forth. I don't know how they do it. They must have hundreds or thousands of people they're talking to, but it always seemed like they knew exactly who we were and what was going on. And
yeah,
that's cool. The other thing I offer too, for no cost, is they will track you as well on the PredictWind tracker. And if they see something that you should be aware of, they'll let you know. Maybe it's really changed, and they'll just say, hey guys, just making sure you're aware of XYZ. So
yeah, interesting.
They advertise themselves as 5 a.m. to 5 p.m. 7 days, 365.
Yeah.
And it's a team. It's not just one person.
Yeah.
Sure.
It's a big, actually. Yeah. So
what does each drink cost?
Sure. It's if I can remember right. So I think that first summary is like $50.
Yeah.
And then the 3-day forecast en route is $60 or $50, and then like the 5 days $80.
Mm.
And then the phone a friend is like $40, I think. If you had to
Yeah.
talk to them. No, it's not. It's in our case, it was. I think we spent $300 coming over.
Yeah.
I didn't know. I thought it would be super expensive. I don't feel like that's that expensive compared to. I spent $300 on a piece of rope before I left. So.
Right. Yeah, that sounds super reasonable to me. I mean, I was expecting a number higher than that. I've never used one. I wasn't really calibrated. So that sounds like a pretty good deal.
It's up to you, and you can decide. I think after we did like 3 or 4 of these 5 days, and then the last one, okay, we were 4 days away from the Azores. We kind of knew what we were going to expect, so we were like, "Thanks so much. We'll talk to you in a couple of weeks when we get ready to leave." And it's all good.
Sounds great.
Bela, what an unbelievable start to this story, and we're only halfway through it. What struck you as the most interesting elements of this first leg of their journey?
Oh man, this was really a good conversation I had with those guys. I really enjoyed it. As we learned from the previous episodes where they talked about planning, I thought they did a super job about prepping for the trip, from food to taking first aid courses, to changing equipment on the boat, having triple redundant systems on the boat, etc. Having a weather router. They did all the things that if you're going to read books or listen to other people say that you need to do. And as with all things, all good plans, it's just a plan, because then different things happen and change. And they certainly had a few of those. I think the thing that struck me, one of the things that struck me the most is it's a long trip. It took them 17 days, which actually is a good pace. So there's plenty of people who it takes 24, 25, 27 days, just depending upon weather windows. And you're on a sailboat. If the weather doesn't, if the weather's not in your favor, you could bop around in the ocean for a couple of days and not make any progress. So it's a long trip. So it's probably, 4 or 5 years of coastal cruising crammed into 17 days. So if you think about sailing coastal cruising for 4 or 5 years and the wear and tear on your boat that's going to happen, now all of a sudden all that wear and tear is focused in 17 days. So I think, that's sort of a big takeaway for me. You got to think about it that way. And I also, Simon said it was the hardest thing he's ever done, but he also said it's one of the best experiences he's ever had. So I've read this before on highs are super high and the lows are super low. And it's this real roller coaster. And the roller coaster can change, frequently. The highs and lows, it can change in 30 seconds. You can go from a high to a low or vice versa. So I think that's another thing that you just sort of have to be prepared for. You have to know that this is how it's going to be. And in a very small microcosm sort of way, I've experienced those on day trips, right? You go out for sailing for a day and it starts out beautiful. And then, within the span of a half hour, you're in the middle of a thunderstorm. And it's like, well, what happened? So I think the other thing is interesting is this notion of you're on a sailboat. So when there's no wind, what do? Do you turn on your motor and use up fuel? Because you clearly don't have enough fuel to motor all the way across the Atlantic. And they took extra fuel with them in some, 5-gallon jerry cans, as they're called. But what do you do? So managing that is sort of an interesting thing you need to think through. Oftentimes, as they said, if you have no wind, you want to motor, because if you don't motor, then the next storm that's coming, you might be on the wrong side of that next storm. So, or you want to move north or you want to move south, you want to move in a particular direction so you can position yourself for the next weather front that's coming through to take advantage of it. So if you don't motor, you're going to be out of position. So there's this real sort of planning and tactical piece that kind of comes into this that you need to sort of figure out. So I thought that was a couple of things that sort of struck me. What were some of the things that really struck you, Mike?
One of the things you can explain to me is this thing about the wind vane and the autopilot. That was something I really didn't understand. Can you give me a quick explanation?
Sure. So most boats, like my boat, has an autopilot on it. So I can put in either a heading or a waypoint, and the boat will steer itself to that. And it uses the GPS. And it's on my boat. It's an electronic device that's hooked up to a hydraulic pump that runs and will move the tiller. Will move the rudder on my boat, so it steers the boat.
Yep,
it works great.
Yep.
And they're super great. Now a wind vane is an invention that somebody invented. I don't know who invented it, but it's really clever. So it's a Rube Goldberg looking device that bolts onto the stern of your boat, bolts onto the back of the boat, and it's got a fin that sticks down into the water, and it acts as a rudder. So you take your rudder and you sort of lock your rudder on most of these. You lock your rudder, and there's a fin that sticks down, and that acts as a rudder. And then there's an other fin that sticks up in the air that is like a small sail, but it's not a sail that flaps around. It's got a frame around it, and then in between that frame is some cloth that makes it look like a sail. Okay, and it's sort of long and skinny, maybe 3 feet tall and 8, 9, 10 inches wide. And this thing is mechanically connected. They're all mechanically connected through some ingenious mechanism. So what happens is when the wind blows across the sail in a certain direction, it changes the angle of the rudder that's in the water. So you can imagine if the wind blows that sail this way, then the rudder turns the boat in the proper direction to balance out the wind again on that sail that's sticking up, and vice versa. And it takes a while to sort of tune these for your boat, right? You just don't bolt it on. Like my autopilot, you basically plug in the wires, you turn it on, and it works. These wind vanes take a little bit of tuning to your boat, but they work great. And they work 24 hours a day. They don't use any electricity. They don't use any power. And all sort of long distance sailors use them because, again, it goes back to most autopilots Yeah, they're good, and they may work for 17 days in a row, 24 hours a day, but they may not. And I think offline, Simon told me some stories of, people who showed up in Horta after sailing there from the United States, and they went through 3 autopilots on the way over.
Wow.
And some of this happens. Some of this is also a function of the types of seas you encounter. So when you're sailing long distances, you're always trying to go downwind. You're trying to sail with the wind at your back, which also means the waves are sort of at your back. And that's when an autopilot has to work really hard, because you're going up the side of one wave, and then you're going down the side of the other wave. And most of the times the waves are not directly on your nose. They're off at an angle. So the boat, as it's going up, is also wants to go to the left, and then on the way down, the boat wants to go to the right, just because of the angle at which the boat is encountering the waves. So an autopilot just is constantly working, and it's working hard because it puts a lot of stress on the autopilot, because it's trying to keep the boat straight. And even hand steering in those situations is a challenge. But in hand steering, you sort of learn how to get the rhythm. But these wind vanes work really great in those situations, because again, you're not using power. There's nothing really to wear out. There's no pumps to leak hydraulic oil, etc. So anyway,
cool. Great explanation.
Thanks.
Now, the next question I have for you is, let's talk a little bit about seasickness. I was amazed at what an issue this was. How does this happen, and what can you do about it? And what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so seasickness is knock on wood, I've never experienced it. And for those of our longtime listeners know that Simon, Sawyer, and I brought their boat back when it was brand new to them from Florida. I was the experienced sailor on that trip. So we sailed it up from Florida, and they always made fun of me because whenever I could, I would take a nap. And I would, if somebody else was on duty, I would go down below, and if I could take a 1-hour nap, I would. So I'd be really rested. And the other thing I did is I used seasickness patches. So there's these patches you can buy. Each patch is good for 3 days. You put it behind your ear, and it helps prevent seasickness. And I use those prophylactically, meaning I just put them on. Like day before the trip, I put one on, and every 3 days I put a new one on. Regardless of how big the seas were, we could be inside on the intercoastal waterway, and I would wear them. And they used to make fun of me about that. And now they've sailed a lot since then, right? They have several thousand miles of sailing along the east coast of the United States, particularly up in Maine, where they did multi-day passages, and neither one of them ever got sick. However, on this trip, they did get sick. And seasickness is caused by some sort of miscommunication between your eyeballs and the little grains of sand in your inner ear and your brain. And it gets confused because your eyeballs are saying one thing, and the little grains of sand in your inner ear are saying another thing, and it causes something to go wacky. But there are medications you can take. There's a whole bunch of wives' tales types of remedies that you can try, but there are medications you can take. And the dangers with seasickness are you vomit, you can't keep food down, and you can't keep water down. So you have a danger of dehydration, and you get malnourished. And it can become extremely, extremely dangerous. People die from this because of dehydration. So you have to manage it. And I think at one point in time during my conversation with Simon, he was saying, look, my goal for the day was to drink this 500 milliliters of water and keep it down. That was the goal for the day. So he was pretty seasick. So I think here again, it's interesting, right? They did all this preparation. They did all these things. They'd never been seasick before, but they didn't, bring the patches. So I think that's an interesting lesson learned, right? You have to be prepared for everything. And part of the challenge with seasickness is once you get seasick, a lot of these medications don't work. So you almost need to start the medication, whether it be Dramamine pills or patches or whatever, prior to your departure. And there are some side effects. Some of them make you tired and sleepy. And as Simon said, right, you need a couple things. You need to be rested, you need to be hydrated, and you need to have nourishment. Those are three things. If you don't have those three things, then your body starts shutting down. You start becoming a liability as a member of the crew, as opposed to an asset. And so it's really important, particularly when there's only a few of you on a boat like that, that everyone try to stay healthy. That I think is sort of a real important lesson from this is, be proactive about preventing seasickness. And some of these things have some side effects. So, a month before you're leaving on a trip, put on a patch at home and
try it.
See what the impacts are. And if it doesn't work for you, then call up your doc and say, hey, what else can you prescribe for me that, can help with this motion sickness stuff? Because a lot of people suffer from motion sickness in airplanes and cars. My sister used to get car sick all the time. I can remember when I was a kid. Right. So it's not just something that happens, if you're on a boat, they call it seasickness. If you're in a car, they call it motion sickness. It's the same thing. Yeah, same exact thing.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So the weather was something that was interesting, and it sounds like they were really prepared for the weather, and the weather seemed like it was pretty good. But how much of that was really lucky, or how much was planning and the kind of the service that they use and things like that? What's your takeaway on the weather situation?
Well, there's certain times a year you want to be in certain parts of the world when it comes to sailing or being on the ocean. So part of it is planning. You don't want to go across the northern Atlantic in January. That's a bad time to be out there. So there's certain weather windows during the 12 months of the year that you want to be in certain places and not in other places. So they followed all the rules there. And then I think the weather routing is really important because it sort of gets a professional set of eyeballs on where you're at and where you're going and what's coming and what's around the corner, so to speak. And if you look at their path across to the Azores, they did make, I think it was like one deviation of probably 100 miles or so. I think it was to the north or south, I can't remember now, to sort of position themselves better for the passing of a weather front. And, 100 miles can make a huge difference in sort of the weather conditions that you encounter. So, right? A lot of these storms are very localized. You're certainly going to feel some of the effects of it, but if you can position yourself 100 miles this way or 100 miles that way, that can make a huge difference. And the professionals who do the weather routing understand that, and they can give you those instructions to say, you know what, for the next day, you want to turn to this heading, because we want to move you a little further south. So I think it's really important. And they got these weather updates like every 3 or 4 days, if I remember correctly. And I think it did make a difference. And if I was going to do something like this, I would not do it without a weather router. And there's a whole handful of companies that do this, and they're all quite good. And they do it for the big ocean ships. They do it for the freighters and the car carriers and the container ships. They all use these services because they too, are concerned about these things.
Yeah, interesting. What about the whole power thing? That was also really interesting to me. They did a lot of work on making sure they had plenty of electricity, and it sounds like that worked really well. Any comments on that?
Well, here's a great example, right? They're off the grid for 17 days. They are off the grid. So they are their own little city. They're making their own water. They're making their own electricity. So, and electricity runs everything. These boats are electric. They're like electric cars. They do have a gasoline engine, which they can generate some electricity with, or diesel engine, I should say. But solar cells have really hit their stride when it comes to boats and the marine industry. And so you got to generate your own electricity because your GPS, everything runs on it. It's just except for the weather vane, right?
Right.
You don't need electricity for the
Right.
weather vane, which is nice. So I think that that's really important, and I know they did. I don't think we talked much about it in the planning episode, but you can do an analysis on the amount of power you're using on a boat. All of the electronic devices say how much power they use on them, so you can kind of figure that out. You can figure out the duty cycle, and you can make an estimate of sort of how much power you need to generate. And you need to do that in a way that's still going to generate sufficient power on cloudy days. So if you have 4 days of overcast skies, you need extra capacity, I guess is what I'm saying, right? You can't size the system just for bright sunny days and say, okay, we're going to have plenty of power. You have to sort of size the system for 50% output, because the solar cell output falls off pretty quickly as the sun goes away. So I think it's important. It's critical. They had 600 watts of power generation, which isn't huge, but it was enough for them, and it seems like that worked really well for them.
Yeah, and then the water was interesting, and the whole thing about hot showers. What was your take on that?
Yeah, well, you know what it's like if you haven't had a shower for 2 days and you've been out camping or something, and you feel grubby, and maybe you feel a little seasick too. I mean, a nice hot shower really improves your spirits, makes you feel better. And so they have a water maker, right? So that's another big challenge. How am I going to get water? Because you can't drink the seawater.
Salt water, right?
Salty, unfortunately, right? So you can't bring enough water with you. So I think what he said was 3 gallons per person per day is sort of what they utilized.
Which is making 1.5 gallons an hour, right?
Right. So and that's a pretty small water maker. There's some water makers will make a much more. Challenge with water makers is they use a lot of power, because you have a big high pressure pump that's forcing the salt water through this semi-permeable membrane that's taking out all the salt. So they use a lot of electricity. But I think it's absolutely necessary, and you have to have one. Now, what happens if your water maker fails, right? So they do make little hand pumps that you can, manually pump water through a little. It makes, very little water, but enough to drink and keep you alive and stuff. But I think it's important to have those types of things. And just like they planned about food, you got to plan about your personal hygiene too. And because those little things often mean a lot when you're in these types of situations. I can remember my son and his wife talking about, because they hiked the Pacific Crest Trail. They started in Mexico, they finished up in the Canadian border, and every 4 or 5 days they would pull into a little town, and the first thing they wanted to do was take a hot shower. That was like number 1 on their list. So it's no different being out in the ocean.
Yeah. So other than the seasickness, it really sounds like everything worked as well as it possibly could have. And I think there's a solution to, hopefully, for the next leg of the trip. We'll find out, right? But hopefully the seasickness battle can be won,
Yeah.
We'll see.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, sounds good. Let's wrap this episode up and get on to part 2, Mike.
Agreed. I can't wait to hear it. Listeners, thanks for joining us for yet another episode. We hope you found our conversation both interesting and thought-provoking. And as always, if you have questions about what we've discussed, please feel free to get in touch with us. Our email is sailingtheeast, that's all one word, @gmail.com.
And if you enjoyed the podcast, hit that follow button on your favorite podcasting app. It increases the visibility of the podcast and lets other people find it very easily. So until next time, signing off from upstate New York. See you all soon.
And from over here on the east side of the Atlantic, where Simon and Sawyer are now, signing off from Münster, Germany. I'll see you next time, Bela.